That was great. Yeah. And happy birthday.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Day, Professor Linda Day in the Africana Studies Department. And we are happy today here at Brooklyn College to welcome a scholar whose name is becoming widely known in several fields, Dr. Paul Joseph López Oro, who is a transdisciplinary Black Studies scholar whose teaching and research interests are on Black Latin American and U.S. Black Latinx social movements, Black diaspora theories and ethnographies, and Black queer feminisms. His research interests include Black politics in Latin America, the Caribbean, and U.S. AfroLatinidades, Black Latinx LGBTQ movements and performances, and Black transnationalism. Working on his first book, manuscript, called Indigenous Blackness, The Queer Politics of Self-Making, Garifuna, New York. Professor López Oro is the Program Director of Africana Studies at Bryn Mawr College outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He lives in Bushwick and is a proud graduate of Long Island City High School in Astoria, Queens. He received his doctorate in African and African Diaspora Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, his master's degree in African American Studies from Northwestern University, master's degree in Latin American Studies from the University of New Mexico, and his bachelor's degree in history from St. John's in Queens. He has taught Black Studies and Latinx Studies courses at the University of Texas at Austin, Hunter College, the City University of New York, University of Virginia, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and Smith College. So he has been quite familiar also with the keys as well as private universities. His research has been funded by the Ronald E. McNair Scholars Program, the Tinker Foundation Field Research Grant, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Interdisciplinary Cluster Fellowship in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies. Please, won't you welcome the professor for today, very honorable Paul Joseph López Oro.
I really appreciate the very wonderful welcome with the food and a bit of ancestral libations. Wanted to just give to the Wolf Institute, to the Department of Africana Studies, to the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship here for the invitation. I am a third generation Brooklynite by way of the Garifuna Diaspora in Honduras's Caribbean coast. This is my first time on this campus, so I'm really excited to be in the very kind of institutional soil that cultivated Shirley Chisholm and cultivated such a beautiful intellectual genealogy, especially around Black studies on this campus and in our hometown borough. So for Binafi, buenos dias, good morning. As a recognition that we continue to stand on stolen land, on ancestral terrains, right? People. I'm always also wanting to push beyond a traditional indigenous land acknowledgement and also think about the peoples of African descent who were also very much present in that moment of captivity and stolen land, right? And wanting to also acknowledge their indigenous presence in the Americas, okay? One that I go to a lot, it's a visual that, right? So I think we're at this moment, both in the public speaking, that Black people speak multiple languages globally and locally, right? That we also understand that the Spanish-speaking world has a very long and rich history of Black folks. Some of those Black folks are indigenous, some of those Black folks predated the nation state, right? So this video really captures a lot of those nuances here. Right, it captures all of those complexities, particularly when we're introduced to Dilma Suazo, who is the third generation Brooklynite like myself, right? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the emphasis on the third generation, long history of Black Central Americans in New York City that actually happens before 1965, which is a very important year, particularly for Black immigration in the United States, right? So I want to be able to show you a bit of a visual, but also at the end of the clip, I'm going to point to the ethnographic gems that Dilma really invites us to talk to you a little bit more about the transgenerational argument making in this particular part of
the people just automatically think I'm Black. I mean, they say, they're like, oh, but you look Black. Okay, yeah. But it's more to it. It's more to who I am.
On a Sunday afternoon last spring, several hundred people, mostly of Honduran descent, gathered in a school auditorium in the Bronx for the Miss Garifuna beauty pageant.
The girls, they wear the outfits that the women from the Garifuna village used to wear. When they perform, they're faking the ancestors of Garifuna to Honduras. They're sugarcoated, they're not adding anything modern to it, it's just the culture.
The Garifunas are part African, part Caribbean, part Central American. They descend from the native Arawaks of the Caribbean island of St. Vincent, and also from a group of West African slaves who landed there in 1797. In recent decades, many have immigrated to New York City.
New York is the largest Garifuna community outside of Central America. There are guesstimates that there are 200,000 Garifunas in all the 5 boroughs.
But when it comes to being counted in the census, the Garifunas say they don't fit into any box. Increasingly, there's a disconnect between how different ethnic and racial groups identify and how the census wants to count them. In the 2010 census, more than 18 million Latinos rejected the standard race categories, instead picking the catch-all known as some other race. Many argue, like 22-year-old Dilma Suazo, that they are so racially mixed that they constitute their own race.
Yeah, okay, good. Garifuna, me, is who I am. It's my culture, it's my language, it's my food, it's literally my family.
In the lead up to the 2010 census, Dilma and others in her family selected other race and wrote in Garifuna.
My aunt did it, my mom did it, so hopefully, maybe in the long run, maybe in a couple of years, it will be that box that would say Garifuna. We no longer have to check other and have to write Garifuna.
Who's the cook?
Everybody.
Dilma's family gathered at her grandmother's apartment in East New York with a traditional dinner, dancing, and conversation.
Usually, like if I had to check off a box, I would put as my race or how I would identify myself as Latina. I would never put Garifuna or other, until currently I put other now. But I didn't know if Garifuna was valid. But like if they don't understand where that came from.
You see diversity with Asians and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. You grow up looking at their culture, and then you realize, okay, that's their culture. But what about mine?
Oh, if you're gonna go color-wise, sure, I can say I'm black. If you're gonna go language-wise, sure, I can say I'm Hispanic.
Technically, it's brown skin.
But I mean, yeah, so now you're here, we're like, okay, you got all this other chat stuff, and so we go, you know what? We're gonna go to other and just put Garifuna.
The Census Bureau acknowledges there's a problem with the questions of race and ethnicity. In 2010, they tested different wording in the forms, and last year they held focus groups with a report expected this summer.
All right, so that's Dilma Suazo, and I wanted to introduce her into this space for us to have a bigger conversation around what does it mean to decolonize Black Latinidad? What does it mean to complicate Black folks who are also indigenous in the same breath, right? And Black folks who are indigenous of Caribbean descent in Central America, right? Where when we think about the Caribbean, we don't necessarily immediately think about Costa Rica, right? When we think about the Caribbean, there's not this immediate connection to Central America, right? Yet there's a long history of Caribbean history in Guatemala, right? So one of the things that I'm trying to help us to think through is all of those multiplicities happening here, right, in New York. So I'll start actually, I'm going to switch gears to talk a bit about the Bronx. I know we're situated in Brooklyn, but I wanted to bring Dilma in conversation in particular to what's happening both in the city, but also in both boroughs, right? And this is a part where there's this Sulma Arzur Brown. Sulma Arzur Brown is actually one of the Garifuna New Yorker activists who's holding the maracas to the left. And she writes Spanish and English. She felt unknown to her Black friends, and she was Black. To others, she was Latina. Sometimes I'd be called Afro-Latino, but Garifuna. Her parents, scarred from their humiliations, didn't teach their daughters. But I knew we were Garifuna because we danced punta. Brown says because we ate hudutu. Woman born in La Ceiba, Honduras, and raised in the Bronx. She migrated to the Bronx at the age of 5. Anti-Black racism and discrimination her parents experienced in their workplace in Honduras. Community profit organization called Garifuna Coalition USA Inc., located in the Bronx. Garifuna Coalition USA Inc. emerged in the as an immigrant advocacy and cultural preservation throughout all 5 boroughs, with the political being included into citywide politics. Important because what happens in Brooklyn in particular around preserving Garifuna culture in the 70s and the 80s actually supports what happens in the Bronx in the 90s, right? So, for example, I'm very certain everyone in the room knows that some of the law so Garifuna folks are part of that long-standing Black immigrant community here. So they're actually a much more predated community before the Garifuna Bronx community, right? Established here since 1950s, the early 1950s. Remember, part of the history of the Caribbean coast, especially of Central America, is the United Fruit. Right? So here you have West Indian, Caribbean immigrant workers on Central America's Caribbean coast, as well as Garifuna, right? As well as other Black Central Americans who are not necessarily part of those communities, working, employed by the United Fruit Company, working the docks, and a lot of families would stay, right? So Brooklyn was a huge port of entry, and I'm totally moving around. I am so sorry. Is it picking up? Hold it. Okay. Sorry about that. But folks are able to hear me? Yeah? Okay. Oh, it's the... Got it. Even though I'm doing the switch to the Bronx, what happens in Brooklyn is foundational to what's happening in the Bronx in the 90s, right? So Garifuna communities have been in Brooklyn since the early 1950s. They've been established pretty much. What also happens in Brooklyn and not within Garifuna communities is that Garifuna folks also intermarry into African American and West Indian families, right? So when that intermarriage happens, right, the Martinez gets, right, the Rodriguez gets dropped, right, and then comes upon an Anglophone last name, right? So like if a lot of, that happens a lot intergenerationally, but last names that we'll talk about, I'm happy to talk about what the marking of last name does around negotiations of Blackness and Latinidad, right? Particularly because when we think about Latinidad in the US, we always think about Spanish, right? That Spanish is that Spanish colonial branding is that kind of unity, pan-ethnic connection that happens, which really is ahistorical, right? But it also waters down the nuances and the complexities of those Black histories within those communities, right? So I say that to say is that Black Central Americans are really different from Black Dominicans, right? Black Dominicans are incredibly different from Black Cubans, right? Because those particular nation states have different relationships to those histories around Blackness, right? So when I say that to say is that Black Dominicans are your kind of quintessential, right, Afro-Latinos, right? There's never been a moment why I was not understood to always be Honduran, right? There's always like, but you look Dominican, right? So when Dominicans become your quintessential Afro-Latinos, and they're also this entire history of anti-Haitianism on top of that, it makes the project of AfroLatinidad seem as a project of only recovery, right? It talks about, and let me explain what I mean about recovery, right? So the intellectual project around AfroLatinidad is about centering Black life, Black culture, Black history, Black politics within a Latin American framework, right? So within Latinx communities in the United States, there are Black people. And those Black people know that they're Black here and they're Black in Latin America, right? Yet those histories are really different based on the nation state, right? Latin America has a very complicated project around its racial identity. It's called mestizaje. Right? The nation built itself believing if we are racially mixed, there can't be any racism. If we are so racially intertwined, right, this racial idea of harmony, racial mixture, then there's no racism, right? Well, that's built on the idea of caste systems, right? It's built on the idea, right, when you're in a culture that tells you from birth, mejorar la raza, right? Your job is to better the race. Well, what you're also doing unconsciously and consciously, right, is the project of anti-Blackness with that, right? So mestizaje tells the nation, right, we are all the same. We all are descendants of Spanish conquistadores and indigenous peoples, right? Some nation states actually intentionally erase the history of African presence and don't even include them in the narrative of the nation state. That is Honduras. Right? So Honduras as a nation state uses the project of mestizaje only to focus on the Spanish conquistadores and indigenous heritage. And Black people are actually understood to emerge out post the independence, right? So a lot of the work that I do in the first part of the book, and let me give you a sense of the particular kind of book, the larger book project, but one of the things that I want to also really be clear about is that mestizaje, even though it is a Latin American project, it is a project that travels really well to the global north, right? So when we think about even today in 2024, we heard overwhelming ideas of the Latino vote, Well, the Latino vote actually did what it was actually constructed to do. Right? It actually upheld white supremacist values because it was invented particularly for that purpose, right? In the United States, Latinos become these racially exceptional people, right? Where they're not Black enough, where they're either not white enough, but there's a certain kind of brownness that happens, right? Part of the error around that brownness is that it leaves Black Latinos entirely out. And it leaves actual indigenous Latinx folks out of that conversation as well, right? So that racial mixture, right, becomes the myth of racial democracy. So what ultimately happens in Central America is that you have a long, rich Black indigenous history, that gets marginalized and that gets disenfranchised from the national imaginary, right? From the national identity, right? So this is why generations of Garifuna folks in the US, in New York, right, when they're racialized here, the question marks of, but you don't look Central American, you don't look Guatemalan, you don't look Nicaraguan, right? So to think about those kind of complexities, to just jump in and be like, everyone knows who Garifuna people are. And that is not always the case. And I'm going to also share a little bit of, this book is my love letter to my people, right? It's my love letter to my community. It's my love letter to my family, right? It's my love letter to being Garifuna in New York, right? And I want to share a little bit about kind of the matrilineal line, both in my maternal and paternal line, but also to really kind of acknowledge the multiple geographies, right? The multiple geographies of what I'm calling Indigenous Blackness, both that stem from Central America's Caribbean coast to New York, right? And I'm particularly highlighting the multiplicity of Central America, right? So when we think about Black Central America, it's not simply just one nation state, Honduras or Panama or Belize, right? But to deeply also think about the entire coast, right, of Central America being a Black geography, right? And being a Black geography that's always in movement. Right. So to think about the work of Richard Aiton, who writes in A Search of the Black Fantastic, his idea of diaspora doesn't work if we only think of diaspora through maps, right? If we only think about diaspora through little dots and we point and we say X amount of Black folks here, X amount of Black folks here, right? And Afro-Latin America as a field of study really depends on maps, right? It's a field that says Brazil has the largest Black population outside of the continent of Africa, and it absolutely does. I really also care about the 3% of Black people in Bolivia, right? So part of the demographics, part of those numbers is to also think diaspora has to be more than just about numbers and about dots on a map, right? Diaspora has to be about what is the borderlessness of Blackness, right? What does it mean when Black people are constantly moving borders, right? And in nation states where borders are built on violence, right? Borders in the Americas through sheer violence, right? And we are living in the afterlife of slavery, colonialism that continues these borders, right? These borders continue, right, to be violent. They continue to be spaces where Black and Indigenous people who are constantly crossing are constantly having to fight for their lives, right? To fight for an existence, right? In whatever border they're crossing. So I want to share a little bit about this in particular because how we are in Garifuna culture in particular, we're a matrilineal culture, right? And we are Black Indigenous peoples, right? In the same breath. So part of the ethnogenesis of Garifuna folks is we are shipwrecked slaves, right? We are the descendants of shipwrecked slaves who through hybridity with the Arawak Carib Indigenous peoples on the island of St. Vincent, right? That's the birth of Garifuna people. Right? And that's built into our collective memory. We understand this as a community. We understand us to be Black Indigenous. We understand St. Vincent to be an ancestral home, right? And I'm going to give you a little bit of what that particularly means, right? So St. Vincent being an home is really, really important in the context of Garifuna Central Americans and in the context of Garifuna New Yorkers right here in New York, right here in Brooklyn in particular. So once St. Vincent becomes this ancestral home, right, Garifuna folks, the nostalgia of exile, right? So in 1797, Garifuna folks in St. Vincent were exiled to the British Honduras, right, to the and it was done in particular because, right, part of the shipwrecked slave narrative is that Garifuna folks did not formally participate in plantation life. And I'm always going to pause there to do a bit of unpacking, right? So what does that particularly mean, right? So we're Maroon people, right? We are Maroon people who did not have the official experience of plantation life. That does not mean, right? And this is where I'm always constantly pushing back, right? And this is where, social death and Afro-pessimism and I have a little bit of a really nice dance, right? Where there's a really important conversation around, well, what does it mean to be a shipwrecked slave? Right? What does it mean to also be a Black person in the Americas and understand that your ancestry did not have slavery as a chapter, right? It creates a lot of tension, right? It creates a lot of, not necessarily confusion, it creates a lot of hierarchy, right? A lot of belief of like, you know, Garifuna folks, we're branded as a masterpiece of humanity, like intangible culture, right? So part of that branding, being shipwrecked slaves, actually really helps that idea. Because one thing that is part of what the institution of slavery does intellectually for us, it creates the discourse to say that Black people who participated in that institution don't have culture, right? That their African culture doesn't survive the horrors, right, of the institution of slavery in the Middle Passage, right? And that's a problem because that's not true, right? Black people found to preserve their cultures in all of the most really difficult situations, right? And Black culture definitely survived the Middle Passage. Yet Garifuna folks, because of the shipwreck narrative, are able to claim a certain kind of authenticity, right, around Black indigenous culture. So I'm always, every time I give you a bit of the ethnogenesis, this is Garifuna folks, there has to be a critique around the shipwreck slave narrative, right? Because it also really creates this political imaginary around authenticity, around indigeneity. Garifuna folks are also one of the first Black indigenous communities in Latin America to model to the rest of Latin America what does it mean when Black people stand up and say we are indigenous too, and we have land rights, we have land tenure, right? We have to deeply understand that they're not only troubling the idea of who gets to be indigenous, but they're also troubling the idea of like land. One of the reasons that we don't see Black people as indigenous in the United States is because of chattel racial slavery. We don't see them as possibly indigenous. Like, what does it mean to like literally, and I do this with my students all the time, but like, what would it mean for us to understand African Americans as indigenous to the Americas? It would give us different understandings of how Black Americans built the United States, right? We wouldn't need to like literally have the 1619 Project be a reminder to the nation state, right? It would already be built into our curriculum. It would be built into our understanding. But because we don't see Black people as indigenous, and, right, we hold on to land, right? Land becomes the marker of indigeneity, right? And land becomes the only way we understand indigeneity. So part of what I'm doing in the project here, right? I argue in the book that indigenous Blackness land making, right? That this is Black indigenous people in Beach. Orchard Beach has nothing to do with us at all as a geography, right? This happens in Far Rockaway. This happens in Coney Island, right? So when Garifuna folks are coming together, having ancestral remembrance, bringing ancestors, bringing the drums, bringing the maracas, bringing the hututu, bringing the punta, that is about making a certain kind of Black indigenous space that transcends its possession of the land. Now, I know there's a lot of students in here, and I want to kind of just take a step back and be like, do y'all understand what that means, right? So do folks understand indigenous people, right? Do we have an understanding of who indigenous people are, right? These are people who existed when and where. Right. No, I'm kidding. So indigenous people exist, right, before European colonialism. They're living and breathing in the Americas, right? So they're, right, civilizations existed before the Europeans came to the Americas. Part of that history is that they become people of the First Nations, right? And they are the First Nations, right? My thing about the First Nation narrative is that it holds Black people. Black vice president in Colombia says, my ancestors were brought here in 1545. This is my land. I have nowhere else to go. Right? When Fannie Lou Hamer says about Mississippi, that she has nowhere else. Mississippi is my land. It's in my bones. It's in my flesh. Right? That is the work also doing when Orchard Beach, when they're bringing ancestors to Far Rockaway. Right? And this is done exclusively by the intergenerational work of Mirta Colón, right? These are elders who came to the city in the 60s, in the 50s, right? Who came at times where she experienced racism from Latinx folks, but she also experienced xenophobia from Black Americans, right? Where she also experienced not being able to find other spaces where. So part of it is that they organize, right? Part of the cultural preservation is that there's been a transgenerational organization around Garifuna, Black indigenous culture. And particularly all of us, right? And I'm pretty sure if I first gen, second gen, third gen, right? Part of the very much, and sometimes part of this I'm still thinking through because I turn to Toni Morrison a lot to think about immigration. You wouldn't think that, right? So most people in sociology or, folks who do immigration won't ever think, well, Toni Morrison's gonna be someone who's really generative about immigration. She actually really is. She writes this gorgeous essay, December 5th, 1995, on the backs of Blacks for Time magazine. And she essentially tells the nation, in order for any immigrant to become assimilated into the United States, regardless of hue, regardless of creed, regardless of religion, they have to be baptized in the well of anti-African American racism. That is really groundbreaking, particularly because what Toni Morrison is telling us in particular, that in fact, the most American thing is to hate Black people. And in fact, Black immigrants come to this country not only already having consumed global ideas around Black Americans, right? But also come in with the idea, right? What sociologists uplifted, right? Social thinkers uplifted of the early 20th century, right? That Black Americans don't have culture, right? Mary Waters, brilliant sociologist at Harvard, writes a groundbreaking text on West Indian immigration generationally. And her argument is essentially, right, when West Indians become more aligned to African American culture, they lose certain qualities of aspiration, right? For her, right, when Black immigrants become assimilated into Black American culture, there's a loss of something, right? And it's not necessarily a loss of culture, right? So as someone who's trained in Black studies, I don't see it as a loss. I see it as an expansion of Blackness, right? So when you actually value and understand Black American culture to not be void of anything, to not be a pathos, right? To not be pathologized, what you actually encounter in the multiplicity of Blackness is actually the expansion of it, right? That you actually realize, oh, Blackness is actually beyond the nation state, right? That in fact, Blackness, the nation state always is threatened by Black people. It's threatened about ideas of Black consciousness, right? And I say that to say is that it's a very complicated relationship, but part of that is also social sciences upholding certain narratives and ideas around Black Americans and Black immigrants, right? So just want to emphasize that. I want to a conversation around the intergenerational work around. I want to talk a little bit about Ida Lambert and Mirta Colon, as they're both from the same generation of leaving Central America Coast to come to New York in the 60s. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I think what Ida's point in this personal essay, which by the way was originally, the interview in the personal essay was originally in Spanish, right? So I know that there's a certain kind of loss in translation stuff, but check this out. Quote, I've also seen how things change over time. Even at home in Honduras, our Garifuna culture and our language is losing ground, less and less familiar. And here, it's more so. Children, so 5, they have their own lives and often forget whatever they learn. Who were born, they play with them, they identify with them in the way they dress and talk, music they listen to. Use their own culture. Changing too. with all of the Latinos around now, and salsa. There are morenos, Black Americans, a lot of Latinos. Their quote. She was a co-founder of El Desfile de la huge kind of turning point in New York City's Hispanic political mobilization around cultural preservation and having a space of cultural pride. She was the only Black woman on that committee, of a committee of mostly white Cubans, white Argentinians, right? And she was always trying to uplift as much as possible Black Central America. But in particular, she's also giving us a lot of different things to unpack here, right? When I read this as someone who sees Black Americans as a possible problem. She's thinking about African Americans and she's worried. She had a negative experience, right? And this happened in the workplace. So I see someone who's also not trying to put boundaries on her grandchildren, but still putting certain boundaries around the grandchildren, right? What I often take a lot away from this is this idea that culture, there's something about culture, whether it's Garifuna culture, Black American culture, something is being lost, something is being negotiated, right? All her children are HBCU graduates. All of them were born and raised in East Harlem, right? So even though she's concerned about African American people, right, because of not only just the negative experience she had in the workplace, but what does it mean, right, to also think about, well, what does it mean for Black Americans to be in the company of Black Latinos, right, and vice versa, right? So there's a lot of internalized kind of assumptions, perceptions, right? But then her grandchildren all intermarry with American families, right? So at some point she where it is, right? And part of that, this is where it is, it also becomes a politics of solidarity, right? So there's a lot of work around the ideas. Watkins particularly talks a lot about the politics of diasporic solidarity, right? That there are moments where Black immigrants and Black Americans come together and really share culture, right? What I really want to really push forward in this work a lot is to really think about, well, what does that mean, right, when you also have your own Black indigenous culture, right? What does that mean for that to interface with Black American culture or even other Black Caribbean culture? You'll find botanicas in East Harlem that are owned by Garifuna folks and Afro-Cubans, right? That means that you'll find Black spaces in New York to always have multiple, right? The multiplicity of Blackness present in those spaces, right? And these generations forward, right? Generations born here, generations that may not have been connected to Central America, right? That may not have ever had the opportunity of returning. Janelle Martinez, who is a founder for and by AfroLatinidades, inspired by the lack of representation in mainstream, right? In mainstream media, in the news outlets around, especially Spanish language, right? We were all raised at a time where Spanish language media, you can turn it on and you think you see a country in Europe, right? And that is entirely mestizaje, right? Mestizaje is entirely invested. It's a Eurocentric beauty project too, right? It's this idea that, and it's a common quotidian thing, right? If you grew up around Puerto Ricans will tell you light skin is the right skin, right? Like part of those ideas, the politics of colorism, politics of mejorando la raza are so embedded, right? Are so embedded that when you look into, right, Spanish-speaking television or Spanish-speaking representation, right, you get the lightest hue of people, right? You get the Jennifer Lopez, you get the Sofia Vergara's, right? And then you get the one Celia Cruz, right? Even though there are literally millions of Celia Cruzes throughout the Americas, yet she's the one representation, right? Then you get the one Roberto Clemente, right? You get these one moments in Black Latinx history, which makes you to think, well, Black people are not a majority in Latinidad. Well, we are. We are literally the majority. The majority of Latinx people are Black indigenous, right? Yet the project of mestizaje creates a lot of these different illusions and confusions, okay? And I want to bring it to Sulman. I want to bring it back to Sulman, but really appreciative of Sulman's narrative. Sulman was born in Honduras. Sulman comes really young to the U.S. And Sulma's in a part of the Bronx that had not gotten Garifunized, right? So she's at a part of the Bronx that was both historically Black American, both from the Deep South and not, right? We often forget that Black folks in New York have been here generationally too, right? That they were not only bounded to the South, right? And then Puerto Ricans, right? A particular kind of Afro-Latinx Caribbean space. So for her, that helped identity around her Blackness. Because one of the things about, even though AfroLatinidad is not a new project, the public discourse of it is new, right? So when we talk about Afro-Latinx communities, not all Latinx people of African descent understand their Blackness to be present, or can recognize their Blackness in company of other Black people. So what does that mean? Everybody knows this meme, right? No, I'm not Black, I'm Dominican, right? That's really popular, really famous. Part of what that erroneously does for us in 2024 is that it actually doesn't point to the complicated relationship that Black people have to the nation state, right? So even when Dilma said, right? Dilma was like, yeah, I'm Black, but, right? Dilma's pointing to being Garifuna as something as, this is different from being Black. That's not the case, right? So when you actually dig in, and I have an oral history that's going to be part of chapter 1 in the book with Dilma, is that what Dilma deeply understands is that her Blackness is the first thing people see when she walks into a room. Her Honduranness, right? Her ability to speak Spanish, right? Her ability to also speak another language that isn't English, that isn't Spanish, right? To be able to tap into Black indigeneity, that for her makes her a marker of alterity. There's a marker of alterity and difference for her in there. For me, is an expansion of Blackness. For me, it really creates the ability for Black people to not have borders, right? And borders doesn't really help Black folks. The nation state is not something that's going to protect us in every moment. And I think we saw that in this election, right? So part of what I'm trying to really think through and really push here is to think about how are Garifuna New Yorkers building space around their Black indigeneity. And they're building space also around Blackness at times where, at a time where Latinos still think of Afro-textured hair as bad hair. Still a quotidian practice, right? I'm really grateful for a lot of the social media activism to really debunk a lot of the anti-Blackness. Part of it is, the reality is that we're really sitting in the afterlife of slavery. And when we sit in the afterlife of slavery, we're also extending what the project of mestizaje is. And before I finish up, I do want to definitely make sure that we have a clear sense of what I mean about the project of mestizaje, because it's one that really helps us to understand a couple of things. When I think about the Americas, and when I think about the United States, when I think about Latin America, when I think about Black people and Black history in the hemisphere, I have to think about a couple of things. I have to think about the historical record, right? So the historical record tells us that during the span of the transatlantic slave trade, the majority of enslaved and freed Africans arrived, right? So a very small percentage actually makes it to the United States throughout the long trajectory of the transatlantic slave trade. So even though Black Americans, when we look at the colonial archive of the Americas around Black history, are a smaller population, they also still have the largest political mic in the hemisphere. And that's really important, because not only are Black Americans in the East, right? Which also gives them, right, in certain aspects, that mic, it's a very double-edged sword mic, right? So part of what, even though, and this is a question I've been dealing with for like over 2 decades. How do you go from a region that was predominantly Black and Indigenous to a predominantly now mestizo region, right? Mestizo are the kind of quintessential national subject, right? The brown subject, right? The interracially mixed subject that emerges, right? How do you go from literally having the entire population, the majority of your population, be Black and Indigenous, and then completely change after the wars of independence are won, right? So just like in the United States, the American Revolution doesn't happen without Black Americans. And just like in Latin America, the wars of independence would have not been won without Black and Indigenous military presence, right? So when Black folks are building nation states for white supremacist nation states that will then turn around and exclude them from nationalism, exclude them from national belonging, right? Imagine, I mean, what does it mean to literally fight for a country who won't give you a birth certificate, who won't give you citizenship, who won't give you access to democracy, to the republic, because they don't see you as a political subject? That's the history of Garifuna people in Central America. That's the history of Black people in the Americas, right? So I want to leave it there. I'd love to open up the space for a little bit more conversation. Are we good with time? Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, I have no words, so many nuggets that you put so much.
Yes, thank you.
As someone who, you know, my work centers the Greater Caribbean space, and I do teach on, you know, the Garifuna people, but I'm learning today, just like you all are. So we're open for questions. We are good on time. Any questions, Professor?
Yeah, and I'd love to know if there are any Garifuna folks in the room, because when I give this talk, there's a ton in the Bronx, right? And there's a ton in Manhattan, but I was really looking forward to see if there were any Garifuna students in the room. I know there's some definitely Garifuna Brooklyn College alum, but I wasn't sure if there was anyone in the room. Or anyone from Central America, Black Central America. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
Questions? As we think about Black Latinidad, how many of us have heard of the Garifuna people before today? A couple of us?
Okay.
So there's a question in the back.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm from Costa Rica.
Okay.
And so one characteristic, I'm not from the Caribbean, I'm from the central region of the country, but our Caribbean is not Garifuna, but it's also
it's West Indian, it's Black,
West Indian and Indigenous. And there's a lot of cross-border migration too. A lot of those families are, you know, they have, you know, some of them live in Limon or on the Costa Rica side, but their cousins live in Panama, in Boca del Toro, and so on. So. But anyway, that's just anecdotal, just to say I'm a fellow Central American, but from a different region. But would you say more about the language, the Garifuna language, you know, sort of its history, origins? I'm curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I always appreciate the language question, because New Yorkers are my perfect answer to that. Garifuna New Yorkers in particular, all the folks you see on this gorgeous image, and I love this image. This is like, it's going to be the book cover, right? Like, I love this image. I think it captures everything I'm doing in the book. But part of the language is that you actually, and the reason I make the New Yorican comment is because Garifuna New Yorkers in particular, even though in the fear and in the danger, right, of losing language, in a language that has also been branded as indigenous, as very authentic, as an African language, right? So there's a lot of a lot of emphasis in preserving it, right? The majority of folks here don't speak Garifuna fluently, right? And part of the politics around cultural preservation is that then Garifuna, the language of Garifuna becomes a politics of creating cultural consciousness, right? So instead of having the fluency of a conversation, if you can cite the Garifuna songs of a punta, right, or of a degu, or of a song that remembers the ancestors, they become the ability to have that reclamation around Black indigeneity, right? But language in Central America is going to look really different, right? So I'm giving you a response from a Garifuna New Yorker perspective, but in Central America, Garifuna language becomes the only way they're able to really claim land rights and cultural different rights within a constitution that they had to fight to even exist in, right? So part of the language, it becomes the marker of this is our indigeneity, right? So like my grandparents, right, they don't speak Spanish, right? Like this generation, all are born into Garifuna language, right? They don't speak Spanish until they have to when they leave their community and they come to New York or they come into the interior of other parts of Honduras, right? They don't learn Spanish until about their late 20s. So Garifuna, in their world, Garifuna language is the only way and form of communicating. But that is 2 generations away, right? My focus is the Garifuna New Yorkers who have a very kind of similar New Yorican kind of wanting to recover, right? New Yorkers are always in this recovery of their Boricuaness, right? So when you meet New Yorkers, they're like real hype about being New Yorican, right? And they're like real proud about being Boricua, even if they've never stepped on the island, right? And actually stepping on the island is irrelevant, right? To the kind of cultural work that I know folks call it like Spanglish or like kitchen Spanish, but a lot of that kind of intimacy, that interior world that Garifuna folks are creating in their own language spaces is really important. It keeps that kind of cultural connection alive. And Costa Rica, I thank you for bringing up Costa Rica because the Marcus Garvey that we all memorialize today does not get politicized in Harlem, he gets politicized in Limon, Costa Rica. So all of this Pan-African brilliance that Marcus really brings forward happens in his tribals in Central America's Caribbean coast. It happens in Colón, Panama. It happens in Limon, Costa Rica. So part of what Pan-Africanism does too is that he's writing for Spanish-speaking Black people too, right? And Marcus Garvey experiences that because he meets Black Central Americans who are not just simply from the West Indian diaspora, but who've also been part of those nation states for literally for centuries. Yeah. Thank you for the language question. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? We have one in the back.
You said you're Garifuna, right? Like growing up, how did you try to when you saw no representation, how did you try to stay away from the Western side and trying to avoid that and being more in tune with the culture? Because I'm sure you went through a lot of obstacles for people to make you feel that way. So I just wanted to ask you that.
No, I appreciate that question. And I think it's interesting. I always have to go back to the home to answer that question. I grew up 1510 Jefferson Avenue, right in Bushwick, right between Wyckoff and Irving. And I grew up in the living room where there's an image of Joseph Chatouillet and an image of Marcus Garvey slapped in the middle of my living room my whole life. We were a Black household. We were Black people who understand ourselves to be Black here, Black there, but we also understood our Blackness to not be the Blackness like everyone else, right? So there was a very clear, these beautiful women behind me, there was a clear conversation, no somos negros como ellos, right? There was a clear idea we are Black, but not like them, right? That's that generation. That generation was real gung-ho about nunca fuimos esclavos. We were never slaves, right? Which really permeates our collective identity, right? That is a really big marker of who we are. one thing that I know my family in particular was fearful of was my folding into Black American culture. Particularly because they always thought of Black American culture as something that would not connect Garifuna people. And I was like, no, that's just because you don't know, right? And I had to do a lot of work in my family, right, in my Black Honduran family, to make them understand what a Black American history is and was, right? You know, I had Black teachers all through K to 12. I went to Brooklyn schools all the way from kindergarten all the way to middle school, right? And even in that moment of like, even when you brought up the Long Island City High School, just brought me up to my parents because they had a deep fear of me going to Bushwick High School. Because at that time, Bushwick High School, you weren't getting out. Like you were going in and maybe not, right? So part of it was also this idea of like, let's send him out of the neighborhood. Like, let's get him out of here, right? And I think later on in their lives, they gained a deeper value about what it meant for my Garifuna-ness to be folded into African American culture in a way that doesn't create. I'm a student of Audre Lorde, so I believe difference unites us than actually divides us. Audre Lorde spoke deeply about how difference was actually a marker of unity rather than just pointing to the similarities. I can point to you to all the similarities we have as Black people, right, throughout the different diasporas, but I actually think differences bring more nuance and more complexities and more richness to what it is to be Black in the Americas. So it's a complicated question, right? But I wasn't really invested in this idea of Latinidad because they also weren't really invested in Latinidad. They didn't know what Hispanic was when they got here until 1982. Like, what's that? Right? Hispanics don't exist outside of the United States. Does everyone understand that? Right? Okay. So Hispanics, Latinos, right? That Latino vote, that's not Mexico, right? That's not Cuba. That's not DR. That's not Bolivia. That is here, right? So Hispanics is a U.S. invention, right? So when I have the opportunities to teach like intro to Latinx studies, I'm like, we're a whole invention, y'all. We are made up, right? We are made up by the imperial beast we call home, the United States of America, right? So part of that history is like, they didn't really, no, it just didn't really relate. Like when Dilma was like, I'll go to other and write Garifuna, I was like, yup, all of us did it. Like it makes perfect sense, right? But also for the data, I think for me, and I'm happy to talk about data because I think data is really important because we're left out. Right, so that Latino vote you saw in Telemundo, Univision, MSNBC, right? That's not me, right? Like that, literally the Latino vote is not that, right? So part of it is like, when you have data that says that Latinos are other race and they're not Black or they're not indigenous, you leave Afro-Latinos out. So I'm more worried about that, whether I find Garifuna representation, because I had a lot of Garifuna representation at home already. So I was good with that in terms of like public discourse. But I'll tell you this, till this day, I always have to give someone Garifuna one-on-one, right? Because they're like, you don't look Honduran. Yes, I know. I don't look like the star of Ugly Betty, America Ferrera, who is a whole Honduran person. Yes, we look entirely different. Because she's from the interior and my people are from the Caribbean coast. So yeah, thank you for that question. I appreciate it.
Any more questions? Here we go.
So thank you for a great talk. I have two questions. So my American Identities course is here, and we just finished up reading Patsy. And we've been talking a lot about intersectionality and the unique experiences that immigrants have when coming to America. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the Garifuna immigrant experience, specifically in the context of like everything that's been going on with the recent election and things of that nature, and all this conversation about who are these immigrants at the southern border. And the second question I want to ask, how was the conversation between the Garifuna community here in New York and those that are still back in Honduras and such? Like, what is that like? How is the translation and conversation going with that?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. Really, really rich conversations. So one thing about immigration, especially right now in the present moment, we continue, walk with me on this idea. I've been working through this thinking a lot, and I always get really different responses. So let me start out with this idea. Black people in the United States do not have the luxury of being an immigrant subject. Walk with me. The immigrant subject in the United States is not one that we immediately understand as a Black subject, right? So when we talk about immigration in the United States, we don't think about Black people. And the only time we think about Black people is the African continent or Haitians, right? Boom. We don't think about the 100,000s of other Black immigrants coming from Spanish-speaking Latin America, because in the United States, when we think about immigration, Black people are not part of that conversation. Because what does a settler colonial nation state that is built on slavery and genocide do? It makes its Black people non-immigrants. And the history of slavery in the United States forecloses Black people into the conversation of immigration. Because even the immigrant subject has humanity, while the slave subject does not. Walk with me. So that's a really, really densely, theoretically hard one, because this is where me and Afro-Peasantism are like low-key first cousins, right? Because part of what the institution of slavery does, right, to Black subjectivity, right, is that it creates this idea of non-human, right, and subhuman. And we've heard this, we know this, right? The immigrant subject, right, is treated much more democratically than the slave subject. And when you are a Black person who understands that your life is in the afterlife of slavery, you'll see how the American democracy actually closes off Black people to immigration, right? So 1965 was this incredible moment for Black immigrants in the US, right? It was the floodgates, it was open. This is where the status quo was taken off. This is where Black people were able to come. Black and brown folks, right, throughout the globe came to the US. The reason I'm thinking through this a lot, because the more I realize, the more we just live. And the more you understand is like, God, this country doesn't understand that a big chunk of Black folks here are literally from other places of the world. Like, literally, that is still a thing that you have to remind people, right? So when you're watching Telemundo, I mean, it's really frustrating to me. Because when you're watching Telemundo and you're watching the Central American caravan crisis and you're seeing all of these supposed undocumented folks crossing, right? They're not focusing on the Black folks who are also crossing, right? They're not focusing on the overwhelming amount of Black indigenous people crossing, right? And indigenous Latinx people who don't speak Spanish, right? Who are coming from the depths of Guatemala, who haven't been exposed to that European colonial language, right? So part of the immigration stuff for me is like, I'm really still trying to figure that out in my writing because we're not present, right? And part of that not being present, then we become the model minority, right? Because then, I mean, what's the undercurrent in Mary Waters' work? And it's not to emphasize Mary Waters, she's just kind of really like a big deal when it comes to like Black immigration research. I mean, part of what's there, what's really, really present, is this idea that Black Americans are going to like keep Black immigrants down, right? That her belief is that if they get ghettoized, right? And she uses Americanized throughout the whole book, where she's really, for me, is coded language around if they get ghettoized, they lose aspirations of education. I'm like, then you don't know Black American history, because Black American folks are literally the vanguard of the educational movement in this country, right? So part of that is, I still got to work through it. It's also probably my hangs up with Latinx studies, because Latinx studies is a field so consumed by immigration, so consumed about the idea of like, we've been here, we're Americans, and it's like, yes, right? But there's also a racial history to that, right? And the fact that Mexican Americans, 1848, they're the first community of color to get citizenship. This is before African Americans become citizens, right? 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo not only gives, right, completes manifest destiny for the U.S., it gives Mexican land to the U.S., but it also, all of those folks living in that previously Mexican land magically overnight become American citizens, right? So part of that is it's a really tough one. Now, the second question about Garifuna folks in New York and in Central America, the really beautiful thing about social media is that it really allows for this transnational hemispheric conversation to exist. Again, we're still in that conundrum where generationally, a lot of Garifuna folks are always constantly worried about the loss of Garifuna language, Garifuna culture, Garifuna music, right? So like, 2 days ago, I heard in the Bronx, a Garifuna punta mixed with like rap, reggaeton, a little bit of drip, something else. Like, it was just like a whole thing. And I was just like, yeah, this is the diaspora. This is the sounds of the diaspora, right? That all of these different Black sonic cultures come together, and that this becomes its own like Garifuna New York world. Because Dominicans in New York are also doing this dembow. They're doing a reclaiming of Black sound too. So Garifuna folks are kind of in that conversation. So it's really beautiful to see. But then the generational hierarchy is coming, right? Because then the elders are like, this is all very much elder driven. Oh, and even this, like this, boom. That's all elder driven, right? That's all elder driven who are queer folk, right? Saying we have to preserve our culture even if we're here, right? That there has to be something that holds us together despite of the fact that this is our new home. And our new home could have been since the 50s. It's still new. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you.
So we have time for one question.
Oh, I'm also from Honduran descent also, and I want to ask you, like, growing up, did you ever experience like where you were either too Black or too Hispanic or too much from one culture, whether in family side or with friends, and did that ever make you question your own identity here?
I love it. And I love it particularly because I'm turning 40 on December 27th, so it's a good time to reflect on all of these kind of really good questions. I want to say that there was never the Afro-Latino reader talks about this idea of triple consciousness, which is built on W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, right? That Black Americans live in two worlds, right? So this is precursors the kind of Gloria Anzaldúa, ni de aquí ni de allá, this idea of like neither from there nor from there. Du Bois really is the kind of the first thinker of thinking about the multiplicity of Black folks, right? And the multiple worlds that Black people live in. Part of what the Afro-Latino reader sometimes for me gets, and Miriam Jimenez Roman, presente, right? Triple consciousness doesn't always work when you're a Black presenting Latinx person. So what does that mean? Have I ever felt the duality of both of those worlds? Yes and no. I've always had to explain why I speak Spanish. I've always had to explain in public spaces, oh, you speak really well Spanish. Where did you learn it? Even today, that's totally normal, right? Even in a city like New York, where I'm like, you clearly see Black people speaking Spanish all the time, right? So that duality doesn't get frustrating. What gets frustrating is always having to explain it, right? And always having to have it be a marker of something else than what you are, right? I'm very clear on my racial and ethnic identities, right? Those are really clear to me. I can't really spend a lot of time making sure that people who are unclear about them understand it. So what does that mean? Let me turn your question into like a professional field question. I am trained in Black studies. I have a master's degree in African American studies. I have a PhD in Black studies from 2 different institutions. Yet in the field, right, I'm in the outskirts of Latinx studies, right? But I'm someone who is read in Latinx studies and at times isn't always read in Black studies, and then vice versa. So what does that mean? I'm constantly having to negotiate not only my Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Honduran presence, but also having to negotiate borders of fields, right? So the borders of those fields is that Black studies, if Black studies is the project where we only are thinking about Black Americans, then we are out of that project, right? But Black studies hasn't always been about Black Americans. And in fact, right, the Black Studies movement in this country was also led by West Indian folks, right? Was also led by other Black people from the diaspora. So when you have curriculum that only focuses on Black people in the United States and doesn't focus on the vastness of Black people in the rest of the hemisphere and in the continent and in Europe and the globe, we get one idea of Blackness, right? Or one idea of where we can situate Blackness, right? Part of it has a lot to do with pushing boundaries, but also the project of nationalism. The nation state has all of us in a choke, literally. I love me some Nicole Hannah-Jones. I will always teach Nicole Hannah-Jones. I think that project is radical. I know her audience, right? It's a radical project for that audience. But it's also a project that folds Black people into the very nation state that told them they couldn't be citizens until 200 years after 1619. And then when they became citizens, they had limitations to that citizenship, right? So the nation state's gonna kill us. Like literally, that's what I basically have been trying to say throughout this entire thing, but without those explicitness, right? So yeah, I mean, it's weird. I grew up with a lot of Boricuas. There was a time in middle school where people thought I was from like Loíza. I was like, okay, huepa. You know, like it's, you know, like at times I spent a lot of time not worrying about that because we were also the only Honduran family on the whole block, literally on the whole block. So like people just understood that we weren't the same, right? Like our Thanksgiving meals did not look the same. Right? And that's fine, right? What is a tamal, right? Like having to explain that to people. Why are Black people eating tamales? Because Black people also eat tamales and make tamales, right? But yeah, I think it's my Brooklyn side that is just like, okay. Like you get it and you don't get it, right? Like, and then little by little, people know who Garifuna people are. If you're from Brooklyn, you know us, right? Like we've been around the block. Like this is not a new community. We've been here. You gotta know Panamanians, right? Like at least. So like part of that is like, yeah, you know, we've been existing and I'm not really concerned about whether people fully understand our existence, but I do want the scholarship to go to multiple fields, right? So like, again, a lot of my even professional experience, a lot of my work gravitates to anthropology, gravitates to ethnography, gravitates to history, right? So when I'm a finalist in those departments, right? My Black Studies training, yet the nuances of all of this sometimes people don't get it, right? And I don't land the gig because then people don't get it, right? Because some people will either place this extremely in Latinx studies, which is actually making a really clear intervention in Latinx studies, right? And then folks will either understand it as Black Studies or question whether it is Black Studies. Thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Yes, it's about time. It's almost 12:15.
Okay.
My students that are here, my class is the Black Political Identity in a My class is the Black Political Identity in a Transnational Context. They will certainly have been able to identify your discussions of Du Bois, of Marcus Garvey, etc. For me personally, I will carry with me your terminology that Blackness is without borders. Blackness is borderless. Of course, you talk about the Black diaspora, the African diaspora, but I love that term. Blackness is borderless. Anyway, we want to thank Professor López Oro for coming today to Brooklyn College, bringing his absolutely fascinating and cutting-edge thinking about this topic to our university. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming, and look out for more Wolf Institute wonderful, thoughtful, intellectual events in the future.
Thank you. Nice to meet everyone.
See you guys this week. Have a great weekend. You signed in, right? You signed in? Signed in. I only see about 11. Hi. Thanks for your question. Yeah, no problem.